Klamath River Basin in the Pacific Northwest. And it is my pleasure to welcome Amy Cordalis, who is staff attorney with the Yurok tribe in Northern California, and she is going to update us on what has been going on the Klamath. So thank you, Amy.
Figuring out how this works, and it's going the wrong direction. How do I make it go back? Sean, help already. Okay, good. Well, while we're working on that, good morning. My name is Amy Cordalis. I am a staff attorney with the Yurok tribe. I'm also a member of the tribe. And before I...
That thing was up, so.
Oh, go back a little more to the start, yeah. And then I just use those arrows. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you. Okay. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge that my in-laws are in the audience back there, as well as my husband. So during the question and answering period, please be nice. Make me look good. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about something that's incredibly close to my heart, and it's just a pleasure to be here at this conference. And, you know, I've been asked to talk about the Klamath Basin Agreement and the Klamath River, and to focus on the partnerships there and how the tribes and the irrigators all came together to form these quite historic agreements that, if we see them come to be, will in fact be the largest river restoration project in American history. And so, you know, when we look at what's happened here, it can really be a model of how people can be our strongest asset in creating sustainable long-term water use and water management in the future. In the conference yesterday, we heard a lot about various legal procedures and permitting processes and, you know, on and on and on. And this is a story really about what to do when all that fails. Because quite frankly, as I'll get into, the parties to the agreements, and there's over 46 different parties so far that have signed on to the agreements, they went through years and years of litigation, of permitting process, of, you know, FERC relicensing and TMDLs and 401 permits. And nothing worked. Nothing resulted in a Klamath River that reflected the values of the communities there. So that's when they started talking and got together and said, how are we going to shape our own future? And the result was the Klamath Basin Agreement. So what I'm actually going to do here is, if I can figure out how to do it, and I might need Sean again, is play you a short clip of a movie trailer that was released. That's not gonna. Do you know if that clip is still up, Sean? At least, oh, here it is. Here we go. Okay, so this is a short clip from a movie trailer. The movie's called A River Between Us. It was made by a former Oregon state senator, Jason Atkinson, who got together with all the people on the river and started talking about how they shaped these agreements. And I think it's important to see the people's faces and to see the river, and this will give us some really good context to understand how these agreements were formed. So without further ado, I'm going to play us just 2 minutes of this clip.
The Klamath River Basin stands to become the largest river restoration project in the United States history. Bigger than the Everglades, bigger than anything we've attempted before.
There are communities hanging on by a thread. We have got to have some stability.
Anybody who's been seriously involved in water issues in this basin has received death threats.
Anyone that could kill and murder hundreds of thousands of fish didn't belong here.
It's neighbor against neighbor that really breaks my heart.
The federal government put them up the river and they created this whole community based on water, and that's a high desert.
They were not here, neither were the Coho. Look at the tribal legends. Oh, screw the tribal legends.
I think that they still see this as a win for the Indians. I think that scares them.
Well, I think there's racism in this country. I think there's racism in the world. I think the valley is reflective of that.
No more just red tape. We say it's white tape.
I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or Tea Party or progressive or green. I don't care. Fix this issue.
No one did anything wrong. It's that these decisions all made sense at the time that they were made, but the problem is they overallocated the basin and created bitter disputes.
People don't even think about, what am I living on? Whose back am I living on?
A dozen different ways to make power, but there's only one Klamath River, and there's only one salmon run that God made.
Because you are praying for the wrong thing. You're praying for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You're not praying for the right thing.
I truly believe that when the river is restored, we will see our people heal.
I can't in good conscience go back to that other place. I can't do it.
So that gives us a little background about the river and okay. Did I? See, this is the problem with using technology for your presentations is you have to have skills to actually make it work. There we go. From beginning. Wonderful. Okay. All righty. So, then I pressed the wrong button again. Here we go. Okay, so that provided you a view of the landscape and the people involved. And again, because my presentation focuses on the partnerships there, I thought that was incredibly important to get us a sort of sense of what was happening in the community, a sense of the wild and scenic nature of this river at the bottom part of the river, and then how it sort of winds its way up into a working river. And we'll sort of talk a little bit about that. So I think what I'm going to do here for my presentation is, again, I'm not going to get into the real technical pieces of this. And, you know, to be sure, these agreements are as technical, scientific, legal, so on and so forth in nature as they come in terms of water agreements. And so if you have questions about that, I'll do my best to answer those after the presentation. But I'm going to focus on the 1,000-foot level of how these partnerships came to be. And I'm going to use this map to sort of orient us, and then I'll move on to discussion of the agreements, and then talk about some of the lessons I think we can take from the experience on the Klamath. So to start, we are in Southern Oregon, Northern California, and Northwestern California. So you see the Oregon-California border here. So we are in the true north, right? You know, we've heard a lot during the conference about water use that's happening in Southern California. And, you know, this is what's happening on the top of the basin. And, you know, right now, we don't have a lot of water being, you know, moved in a transbasin sense. We do have some water that's connected from the Trinity River here that gets diverted down to the Central Valley Project. And one of the major concerns for the tribe has always been that our water here, which, you know, that's the mouth of the Klamath River, and then the Trinity is one of the major stems, but that our Klamath River water from here will somehow be, you know, make its way down south to try to meet some of those other interests. So, you know, the tribe is always on high alert for the Southerners sneaking up north to take some of the water. So generally, the Klamath, this whole area straddles about 16,400 square miles. The river from its mouth here down in Northern California up to its headwaters around Klamath and the Crater Lake area is about 245 miles. The Klamath River was once the third largest salmon producing river in America. Through this whole basin, it's home to 4 different Indian tribes, a major federal hydroelectric project with 6 different dams that are generally right in this area. You've got a federal reclamation project right through here. You've got your upstream irrigators, and then 6 different national wildlife refuges. So it is it's a working area, and I shouldn't forget the Klamath tribes up here also. It's a working river with lots of different complex uses, as we'll get into. And I'm going to start at the mouth of the river. This is a view of the mouth of the river here. My family is from a village, a Yurok village, Rekwa, which is right there. That's actually my grandma's house right there. The tribal fisheries, we have a commercial fishery that we operate here in the estuary that we allow fishing kind of right through these areas here because that's where the fish taste the best. Generally, the Yurok tribe is the largest and the poorest California tribe. We have about 6,000 members. We were never relocated, so we were always here on the Klamath River. And our Aboriginal territory pretty much straddles the Klamath River up until you meet the Hupa Reservation, which is about 20 miles up the river. Our Aboriginal territory also stretches through the northern, it goes north along the coast and then south along the coast to down just past Eureka, California. We have several court cases that define and confirm and acknowledge our fishing rights and our water rights. But important to this process is that we do not have a quantified water right. So we've never engaged and the state of California has never initiated a general stream adjudication on the Klamath River in California, and we've never pursued other options in litigation format to quantify our water rights. So while we have these, court cases that say, yes, the Yurok tribe has federally reserved fishing rights and water rights as necessary for commercial fish, for municipal purposes, for ceremonial purposes, we don't have a quantified water right, and that'll be important as we move through this presentation. Again, here are some pictures of the tribal fishery. We fish with gill nets, 100-foot gill nets right there in the estuary, and that's a pretty important source of money for the tribal constituents. It's not anything like a ocean commercial fleet, but it does pay for school clothes, so to speak. The tribe has a very, very developed, very scientific, high capacity functioning fisheries department, and each year they work with the Pacific Fisheries Management Council and commercial fisheries and other regulatory agencies to set a sustainable fishing allocation for the Yurok tribe. Based on court cases, we get 50% of the annual harvest for our particular fish run. Here's some more pictures. That's a guy pulling a salmon out of a gill net. And then to the right here, we've got some of our a picture of our dip net fishing. And that is done a little bit further up the river. This is another picture of sort of the most southern part of Yurok country. We're kind of getting into Karuk country here. And I want to just pause and note what a beautiful, wild, scenic river this is. It's really just spectacular. Here's another picture of this. And this is, again, getting up into Karuk country. This is also where Bigfoot lives. So if you ever want to go see Bigfoot, he's up here. So then you get to the to sort of the middle part of the basin. And this is the first dam within the hydroelectric project. This is Iron Gate Dam. It's owned by Pacificor, and you can tell, it's a fairly major, significant impoundment. Now, from here up, this is the last point that the salmon can get past. On these dams, there are no fish ladders. So you saw we've got this awesome, fishery down at the mouth of the river. And we all know the life cycle of salmon, right? They migrate upstream and they go back to where they were born and they spawn, and then it starts over again where they come down the river, go to the ocean, and come back up. when these dams were built between 1908 and 1962, they completely blocked 300 miles of salmon habitat. So that basically ruined. There's lots of different salmon runs on the Klamath River. It completely decimated several of those runs. The ones that still hang on are the Chinook, the fall Chinook. That's the one that the tribe participates in the annual harvest. You've got coho on there, and they're hanging on by a thread. They're listed as an endangered species on the river. You've got a really small spring Chinook salmon run. And those are the best. If anybody ever gets the opportunity to go fish and eat one of those, they're the best. But long story short, once they get here, there's no way for them to get past. And what that meant is, we'll kind of get to this later, but the Klamath tribes, which are at the top of the river, they once had a wonderful, thriving culture based on salmon fishing. And when these dams were built, the salmon couldn't get there anymore. And so now they don't have the access to fish. And I think that's a real tragedy. So we'll go to the next dam here. The next one up the rivers, you got Copco Dam, Copco 1, Copco 2. These are the most significant dams on the river. Let's see. And one of the big problems, the major problems that we've been seeing lately with these dams is behind them, they foster these just terrible green algae blooms, which you saw in the film trailer that's really hazardous to human health. And so you basically have these advisory warnings, when it gets like this, and all that is, this blue-green algae blooming, which happens right behind the dams, where people shouldn't really be in there. This picture, I think, is hilarious because at first I thought this was a guy out there, like, doing some kind of studies. He's got a fishing pole. But then moving up to the top of the river, this is a picture of one of the reclamation project. You've got this sort of picturesque, beautiful field being irrigated. You've got a healthy lake behind it. It looks like everything's all fine and dandy. Well, you might, and then actually, so the Klamath tribes are up here at the top of the river also. Seeing all of this, we sort of just took a virtual tour up the river. We saw the trailer. You might ask, how do we make all this work together? These are obviously completely divergent, completely conflicting interests, where you have at the bottom of the river this wonderful fishery, and at the top of the river you've got this substantial reclamation project providing, water from the Klamath River, from the Klamath Lake to the irrigators. You also have off-project irrigators that operate their own private irrigation systems and whatnot that are diverting from the Klamath River and the Klamath Lake. So, how does it all work? And in short, it doesn't. And what happened here was that in 2001, we really started seeing things come together. And you may have heard a little bit about this recent history here, but I wanted to highlight sort of the impetus of these agreements and how we came to where we are now. So in 2001, I mentioned before that there are two endangered species on the endangered species list, the coho salmon and then the suckerfish up in the lake. And a biological opinion was released which required minimum flows for those two fish. We were in a drought year. As a result, the farmers didn't get their water up in the Klamath Basin. And you see this sign, some sucker stole our water. Well, that's referring to the suckerfish, right? So that year what happened was the water went down the river for the fish, and the irrigators didn't get to irrigate. And it triggered a huge political controversy. And you guys may remember, that was the era of Gail Norton as the Secretary of Interior and Bush as our fearless leader. And then in 2002, so then, as a result, the following year, our good buddies said, no way, we're sending the water down or to the irrigators. So we're sending it to the irrigators, and some water came down, but obviously not enough water came down the river. And as a result, we had the largest fish kill in American history. There's estimated between 30,000 to about 100,000 adult Chinook salmon died. And those salmon were from that fall run that I told you guys about, that the tribe participates in the annual harvest. And I'm going to take us here. I was actually working for tribal fisheries when this happened, and the fish died all within the boundaries of the Yurok reservation. Now, to put this in some context for what it felt like as a tribal member, this was like what I imagined the buffalo slaughters of the 1800s felt like to the Sioux people, where you just had this cultural natural resource that is so tied to everything you do as a people, that supports your livelihood, that supports your health, that, we've relied on these same fish since time immemorial. We've done the same thing where we've harvested them and, enjoyed them and lived by, fed them to our children since time immemorial. And here they are, just basically dying. Not basically, they were dying on, the banks of the river. And what happened was that the water levels were so low, and then you had a big run returning that year, that a bacteria spread amongst all the fish. It was called ick. That's the unscientific name for it, ick. And what it did is it attacked their gills. And I chose these two pictures to show you guys because on the right, the right here, you can see how these fish, it's almost like that disease got in from the inside and made their skin blister and then, explode just like that. And so what they were doing is you'd see these fish kind of come up out of the water and peek their heads, and you'd see that they'd have, something not that severe, but, the start of that happening, and then they go back down, and then if you watch long enough, they'd come back up, belly up, and then they would float to the side of the river. And about over a 3-day period, the banks of the river were literally lined with fish. Just lined, and you can see them, those are all fish, just lined. And not that I like, but this picture is good because it demonstrates just how low the water levels were that year. We saw pictures of that beautiful, thriving river, and that year it was reduced, to this. So this was obviously devastating. And the tribe, in response, filed a litigation alleging that the decision to divert this water by the Secretary of Interior, by the Bureau of Reclamation, was contrary to their trust responsibilities to the Yurok tribe to manage the fish and the water and the river in a way that was consistent with our federally reserved fishing and water rights. The judge in the U.S. Northern District Court conveniently dismissed the issue as moot, saying that now that there's record of the conditions that caused the fish kill, BOR will manage the river and the water levels accordingly, such that this will never happen again. But for us, what that felt like was that we had no recourse. We had no legal recourse. So we hit the streets and we protested, and you saw, the beginning of that trailer, some of the protests that the tribes engaged in. So then moving on, besides that, also in 2006, and we're jumping ahead a little bit here, we, because the salmon runs were getting so low, numbers were, falling down, you had a closure of the ocean commercial fishery off of Oregon and Northern California coasts. So faced with all this history, you had different legal proceedings that were happening at that same time. I talked a little bit about what the tribes did. The other major players there were, of course, the irrigators up the river, who weren't exactly happy with the knowledge that there were a few major things happening that would affect their interests. One, you had the Oregon Klamath water adjudication occurring. And that was adjudicating the water rights on the Klamath River on the Oregon side. The Klamath tribes, through the great representation of the Native American Rights Fund, were involved in that proceeding, and they were getting to a place in the proceeding around 2005 where it was looking like the tribes were going to prevail on their claims to Instream flows, and that they were likely to be the most senior water right. What that meant, of course, for the irrigators was that they would then be, more junior, and that in times of drought, which were becoming incredibly frequent, you would basically, they would be cut off, and that's actually what's happened recently. So you also had the Endangered Species Act requiring more water for fish. You had increasing costs for electricity for pumping water. And then for Pacificor, importantly, remember the owner of the dam, their license, their FERC license to operate the dam was set to expire in 2004. And it was clear from legal analysis that the cost of just removing the dams would be lower than installing the fish ladders. So you basically have these various parties that have substantial interests on the river coming together and saying, wow, none of these procedures that we are engaged in are going to work for us. So some of them say this is a lesson in what to do when all else fails. But basically by 2005, you have the parties sort of calling for a ceasefire. And that's when they started talking. And you had these two guys. So on the left here, you have Greg Addington, who is the executive director of the Klamath Water Users Association. And then on the right here, you have Troy Fletcher, who's a Yurok tribal member and also the executive director of the tribe. Troy drove up to the Klamath Falls area, which in about 2005 when he did this was literally like, battle zone. But he drove up, he met with Greg, and he said, listen, none of this is working, and let's start talking, let's start meeting. And so they basically called for a ceasefire. And these two guys are about the most, bulldog type advocates that you can have. So for them to have got together and said, okay, let's have a ceasefire, it was meaningful. And what it did was basically trigger these agreements. It was the nepotus for 3 different agreements. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to get through these very quickly. But basically, within a period of 5 years, you reach these very technical agreements from 2005 until 2010. We're still waiting for congressional authorization to fully implement these agreements, but in short, we've started some different interim measures that have helped things on the rivers. The settlement parties include 45 different groups, counties. The U.S. technically isn't a party to the agreement until the legislation passed. But generally, you've got all the major players there. I want to focus on, and we'll start with the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, which I'll call the KBRA. One of the key major factors to the entire agreement and why this all works is the Water Resources Program. So basically what it does is it retires some irrigation and it then caps irrigation. And I think this is an interesting point because, in most water settlement types agreements, you see in-stream flows set for fisheries. And a lot of times those are based on minimum flow requirements, which of course, then those become the maximum flow requirements for fish, right? So here what they did was they capped irrigation and then they allowed the rest of the water just to flow for fisheries. One of the other important things that they did was they, and this is where you get into the technical piece, they looked at historical annual flows, they looked at how much more water they could get in the river from retired irrigation lands, and then they figured out when to send those sort of pulse flows to meet key times when the fish are running. And so the combination of having more water, and having water when you need it really accomplished what the tribe needed here. And we couldn't have done that through any other type of venue. We looked at it, well, and of course the ESA still provides the base flows. The agreements don't change any of the flow requirements under the biological opinions. They just add to them. And we couldn't really have accomplished that type of water management through any other type of legal venue. Certainly, I mentioned that the tribe hadn't quantified their water rights, and we have water rights for in-stream flows that could have, through 30-plus year process, provided extra water for the fish. But the KBRA and this water resources program provided a source for us to accomplish those same goals, get water in the river in a fairly short time. Now, in exchange, the irrigators, they've got some funding to voluntarily retire some of their irrigation-based water rights, and they also get greater certainty that each year they're going to get a set amount of water. Right now what happens is in about April, May, BOR says, okay guys, here's how much water you're going to get, and it varies a lot. This year we're in a really dry year, and so they're not getting half as much as they've gotten before. That's really hard to plan, a crop and how much money you're going to invest in each year's crop if you don't know how much water you're going to get. So this provides, a cap on that irrigation where they know how much they're going to get each year. They also got assurances from the tribes that we wouldn't continue to sue them. That was important. Moving on generally, there's fisheries programs about restoring some of the habitat on the river. There's a program about providing affordable power to pump water. There's a county's program, mitigation for lost property taxes. And then there's a tribal program that really has to do with habitat restoration. The tribes will be the ones that do a lot of that work. The funding piece, this is one of the reasons we need federal legislation, is we need about $250 million in new appropriations to do a lot of the restoration work. But importantly, the parties have come up with, $550 million of non-federal funding for both the KBRA and the KHSA. So this is, from our opinion, pretty good financial deal for a large-scale water settlement. Moving on to the hydroelectric settlement agreement, I'm going to kind of quickly go through this, but basically I made the point earlier that the project there blocks 300 miles of salmon habitat, beginning, oops, went the wrong way, right about here. So the agreements contemplates the removal of these, there's actually two dams here, these dams, the Link and the Keno Dam will stay in. Those are actually somewhat, they have fish ladders and they're small impoundments, so they don't really affect in a negative way the river, but these lower ones do, so the agreement contemplates the removal. In 2013, we got a final EIS statement from the Secretary of Interior supporting dam removal. So we're on schedule to proceed with dam removal. We just have to get the dang bill passed in order to do that. They're trying to do all of this by 2020. Whether we'll actually meet that goal, now that we're here in 2015, is sort of hard to guess. The last agreement I'll talk about is the Upper Basin Agreement. The KBRA called for that, and that was basically to get the off-project upstream irrigators on board with the agreements. And that was important because that would provide an additional 30,000 acre feet in water that would go into the upper Klamath Lake. And I'm going to skip some of this because I'm running out of time. But in short, that agreement was reached in 2014. And this is a great picture of, states. You got the former Oregon governor, Don Dentry, who is a Klamath Tribes chairman, and Becky Hyde, who owns a substantial ranch up in the upper basin there, sitting and signing these agreements and feeling great about it. Even though we don't have the legislation passed, we still have done a lot of work in the interim to start restoring the river. That's included this Klamath Basin Coordinating Council. We've got the plan set for the fisheries restoration programs. They've got a drought plan, which has become incredibly important in this year. I mentioned the dam studies was completed. We've also got some of the funding collected for the dam removal fund. And this is moving to where we are. So I've mentioned this a few times that federal legislation is needed in order to authorize these agreements, and we don't have that yet, and that's been our biggest holdup. The water year is turning out to be pretty nasty. Again, we've got 6% of the historic snowpack. And that's a big problem for us because the snowpack provides the water for the fall Chinook runs, in the August, September. That's when the snowpack melts and comes down the river, and we're just not going to have that. So to just wrap up and conclude, I've mentioned this before, but I think a big lesson from the Klamath River here is that what the parties did was they went through years of all these various legal proceedings, administrative proceedings, and figured out things just didn't work for them. And so they got together and they formed these agreements. And the water resources program, the dam removal, the protections for irrigation, the habitat restoration, that reflects what the people of the community wanted, the people of the basin wanted for their future to look like. And I think this can serve as a model for how we can move forward in thinking about creating sustainable water uses and sustainable communities. And two additional points on that. We heard about the Colorado River experience and how really the tribes were lacking from that discussion. And I think what that leads to is an unsustainable future because the tribal water rights are always the gigantic elephant in the room. The amount of uncodified water rights that the tribes hold on the Colorado River is so significant. I mean, it just blows you away. You can look at Appendix 9 in that Bureau of Reclamation report on the study of water needs on the Colorado River if you'd like more information about that. But it's huge. So, as we move forward, those water rights aren't going away and the tribes aren't going away. And here, what happened was the tribes led this whole movement. And they did that because they knew they had these significant, substantial water rights. And the other parties knew that too. And so it created this impetus for everybody to get together and, and create this system that allows the tribes, the irrigators, the, Pacificor, the environmental groups to all work together to figure out how they're going to manage their various needs into the future. And, I think that proves the point that you can't go forward in creating a sustainable water, allocation system and water management without the tribes. And the final point I'll make is just that, we're actually going to go back here. I think on the Klamath, what this showed us was that the existing environmental laws really didn't work for what the parties wanted. And I think that is sort of a reflection of maybe some outdated laws. We heard, I think it was from Peter Nicholson yesterday, about how all these laws were created in the 1800s and infrastructure created in the 1900s. And that's certainly no different on the Klamath River. And those laws do not reflect our current values now. So it's time for an update. It's time for a new way of looking at how we're going to protect our rivers. And the KBRA and these other agreements are a model for how we might do that. So thank you. Sorry.
We've got time for one quick question.
You guys gonna go that easy on me?
Okay, at the break.
Okay, great, good. Thank you, yeah.
All right, last up before the break, I'm pleased to introduce Roy Smith. Roy is with the Colorado State Office of the Bureau of Land Management. He is the lead and coordinator for Colorado on wild and scenic rivers, on water rights, and on in-stream flow protection issues. And he's here to update us or brief us on the MOU between the BLM and the state of Colorado. So, Roy, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for asking me to speak this morning. I think the first thing that I want to say is I really appreciate the emphasis of the last two presentations on working with stakeholders, the human element, the education element, and how we can get to new agreements and arrangements that work, even though our laws and our legal arrangements may not be keeping up with what our current values might be. And so I guess I want to put a disclaimer out there right up front. I'm not an attorney. I work with attorneys every day on different projects and different teams of people, but I'm not an attorney. I made a conscious decision not to be an attorney because in my mind it doesn't involve enough time standing in rivers. And I really like to do that. And doesn't involve enough time fish sampling, and I really like to do that as well. So I want to thank you for taking a little bit of time to listen to this presentation. I know when you look at an agenda and it says talking about an MOU, you're like, whoa, that's a sleeper. I'm going to go out in the hall and talk to my friends during that one. But instead of Memorandum of Understanding, I like to talk about it as a mark of unrivaled accomplishment. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But before I go into that, I want to just say I do have a portfolio, so I have to put a disclaimer up that what I'm going to say today doesn't represent the Department of Interior or BLM position on this MOU, nor does it represent the Colorado Department of Natural Resources decision. So hopefully in my presentation you'll see a lot of beautiful shots of places in Colorado, and we'll talk about some innovative ways for keeping those environments wet. So part of the background I'd like to talk about for this MOU is, what do we often see in federal-state water interactions, which is where I spend a huge amount of my time. And you see ongoing legal battles and disputes that I don't think are a real productive use of the parties' time in many cases. And some of the examples that we have going on today, the BLM in Nevada, a couple years ago completed an EIS on the Southern Nevada Water Authority's groundwater development project. And the BLM is still in court with people arguing over, did we sufficiently use our land use authorities to control the impacts of that project? And should we have limited the amount of water that the state engineer of Nevada awarded to Southern Nevada Water Authority? Those are the kind of legal disputes we are still getting into. Another example is we have legislation being passed that basically is telling the feds to butt out of the state arena. Like in Utah and Nevada, we have water laws that say federal government agencies like the Forest Service and BLM cannot hold stock watering rights. So we have these sort of non-productive, turf-oriented disputes going on that really don't accomplish what needs to happen on the ground in terms of resource management. And then you have these ongoing turf battles that you hear about in the media all the time. And you just have to think about how many times have you cracked open a newspaper and you read a title of like, the latest federal initiative is stealing state water rights. Or on the other hand, the latest state initiative for future water supply is going to absolutely trash federal lands and rivers. The media thrives on those types of stories. So those types of conflicts come into play particularly when we have federal needs for in-stream flows on lands managed by the federal government. When I came into Colorado early in my career, right here in the water division that we're sitting in, we had the Forest Service claiming reserved rights in Colorado Water Division 1 in a big lawsuit. And I just saw how much time the Forest Service and the state and other parties were spending on that litigation, and I just thought to myself, these are important resource management questions, but there has to maybe be another way of, making these streams whole and still providing water supplies at the same time. So BLM started talking to the Department of Natural Resources for several reasons. One is that BLM had already initiated cooperation with the state of Colorado on protecting in-stream flows on some streams that cross BLM lands. Now, as you may be aware, there's a lot of BLM land that has no federal reserved water right, and those streams cross multiple ownerships. And so we really don't have a legal claim on a lot of those streams for in-stream flows. And so the way that BLM viewed it is, what have we got to lose by cooperating with state government on trying to put together some sort of in-stream flow protection? At the same time, DNR was eager to demonstrate that its in-stream flow program could potentially work for some federal purposes. The in-stream flow program under Colorado state law has been in place in statute since the mid-1970s, and it's a fairly aggressive program in terms of the amount of water protected, the number of stream miles protected. It's among the leading programs in the West, and the state was really interested in seeing if it could be used to meet some federal objectives. The other thing that was happening is that BLM, as you may be aware, we're required to revise our land use plans on about a 20-year rolling basis. And we were coming up on land use plan revisions for many of our offices in Colorado that manage river corridors along major rivers in Colorado. Rivers like the Lower Gunnison, the Lower Yampa, the Lower Colorado, the Arkansas River, where there's lots and lots of water use and a big potential for conflict between federal land management responsibilities and water supply objectives. So we decided to enter into an MOU because we saw quite a bit of opportunity to sort of proactively head off conflict and produce some good results for our stakeholders. And one of the first things that we recognized is that, let's see here, where am I? So one of the first things that we had to recognize is that there's a huge economic system in this state that's built on the prior appropriation system, and a huge expectation of continued, reliable water supply because of the prior appropriation system. And regardless of what our land management objectives are as the feds, we need to acknowledge that there's that ongoing expectation out there. From the state perspective, there was acknowledgement that, hey, the reason that people live in this state and they want to be here, a lot of it is the federal lands and the recreation opportunities that they provide. And when Colorado citizens go to these federal lands, they expect to see wet streams. And so we sort of made an agreement that, hey, those federal and state authorities and laws are legitimate, and we need to figure out a way to make both of those authorities work in concert to deliver, the management that our stakeholders are looking for. And so we started writing an MOU. And some of the elements of the MOU are that we acknowledge that basically Congress set it up this way. There is potential for conflict built right into the law because we have the states being given authority to allocate water while the feds retain the responsibility to say yes or no to projects that happen on federal lands. So with that in mind, we said, okay, we need to recognize that conflict is going to occur unless we talk about this inherently conflict-laden situation early and often and with a greater level of education and understanding. So we said, okay, we will communicate even when we know those philosophical differences are going to occur. So for example, during BLM's land use plan revisions, we are required by federal law to do a wild and scenic rivers analysis. There's a lot of stakeholders in the state of Colorado who are very, very uncomfortable with the thought of designated wild and scenic rivers on streams in this state. And so we know right up front that we have that philosophical difference because coming from the federal perspective, we believe that wild and scenic river designation in appropriate locations can be a pretty effective river management tool. So we just said in situations like that, we need to talk early and often to head off the conflicts that can come from those philosophical differences. Let's see here. And the other thing that we agreed upon is that often, what we tend to do is when we make decisions, we only think about the things that are within our sphere of authority. The types of land use allocations that BLM might make, the types of water right allocations that the state of Colorado might make, and we don't necessarily think about what the implications of those decisions might be on state authority or vice versa on federal authority. So we made the commitment to start taking a look at those things. So what principles did we put into this MOU? And I think these are some of the most important points that I want to make. One is that instead of just saying, yeah, we'll cooperate, we acknowledge that this is a conflict-laden area, and to make it work, we're going to have to innovate and stretch as far as we can under the law. And when you look at the laws that govern what we do, there is room for innovation and stretching. When you look at the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, when it talks about putting terms and conditions on federal land use authorizations, it does not exactly say what those terms and conditions have to look like. It doesn't say what elements of the environment have to be protected. There's a lot of maneuverability inside of a statute like the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. When you look at state statute, the state statute that authorizes Colorado's Instream flow program just says that flows may be appropriated to protect the natural environment to a reasonable degree. The natural environment is not defined in that statute, and reasonable degree is not defined in that statute. And so you have a lot of flexibility within that statute to do, types of in-stream flow appropriations that you may not have done historically, and that's what we were looking at. We also recognize that because we have these sometimes conflicting authorities that operate on exactly the same landscape, that having that total or federal state control may not deliver the best results for our constituents. If you want to have healthy lands and healthy rivers, you have to have a blended approach that looks at both state authority and federal authority. And so one of the things that that we have worked on is working with our constituents to understand how federal and state approaches can be blended in these landscapes to accomplish the goals that we want. So some of the commitments that we've made under the MOU is that we're going to explore some innovative ways to allow for the continued use of water facilities. We have a lot of really old water facilities in Colorado that municipal governments rely upon, or farmers rely upon, for crops and municipal supplies, and those facilities come up for reauthorization under historic authorizations or under authorizations of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And so we are committing to look at creative things like in those historic facilities, doing things like having conservation pools, having new operational schedules, implementing stream rehabilitation projects below those facilities. If we have new water facilities that might be needed, we have made a commitment to start to talk early about those. So not just when the application for the federal land use permit comes in the door, but when those facilities first appear in state water planning documents as one of several alternatives that might be considered to meet a future demand. We might actually initiate a conversation saying, hey, if you're choosing among these 4 alternatives, these are the things that you need to keep in mind when selecting which of these alternatives you might implement on federal lands. The other thing that we have looked at is using the BLM planning process to actually avoid some conflicts. Since we know in the future where some of these future facilities and water demands might be, we can possibly make land use allocations and land use plan prescriptions that actually anticipate that future demand. We may establish in our plan, these streams, these areas are off limit for future water supply projects, whereas in this part of the landscape, we will consider them here, and this might be a more appropriate part of our lands to consider these types of projects. The other thing is we will work with stakeholders to, if they want to build a project, to identify projects and project elements that might have both water supply and environmental benefits. It might have a storage of water component in a conservation pool that might be released to benefit downstream values during drought periods and during the times of year when stream flows are really, really low. And so we're having kind of those proactive discussions, and it's all taking place at the same time where the state of Colorado is going through a statewide water planning process. So we're at the right time to have those discussions because the state's taking a really close look at where future water supplies are going to come from. So what has made our MOU, where we've agreed to innovate and stretch, actually work? And this is where you come into the people element. One is that we constantly have new state and federal players. We constantly have new federal managers that are coming in that are not familiar with where the state of Colorado is headed. And, to be honest, most federal managers that I work with do not really wholly and fully understand the prior appropriation system, the complexity of state water rights systems. They don't fully understand the challenge of municipal and agricultural water supply. On the other side, most of the state players that I encounter and work with don't really have a full understanding of federal law. They don't really understand the provisions of the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act, or the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And so what we do is just spend a lot of time educating those players so that they can successfully engage with the people on the other side of the table. The other thing that we do is we're involved in way more outreach than we're accustomed to. I spend way more time in meetings with water users than federal employees historically have, understanding their water supply issues and dilemmas. On the state side, state employees are spending far more time participating in federal processes like stakeholder groups who are talking about potential wild and scenic river designations and wild and scenic river eligibility and suitability determinations. So just a far more higher level of commitment to engage in processes. And what else has made this MOU work is, we just have staff in BLM and DNR who have been around for quite a long time, and we can see issues coming up. We notify each other of issues coming up, and we're educated about some of the flare-ups that can occur. So we make an effort to talk very often about what we see coming down the pike. And the other thing that we focus on is sort of some relentless pragmatism. There's always this potential for legal conflict, but if you sort of take the pragmatic approach and focus what the stakeholders want on the ground, you can often make it work. And, right now we have a governor in Colorado, Governor John Hickenlooper, who is an extremely pragmatic governor, in my view, and I think that, that kind of leadership helps the situation. How can we make this work despite the built-in conflicts? So what kind of successes have we had under this MOU? And I'm just I say encouraged by the MOU because I don't want to say that this MOU is entirely responsible for all these successes. It's based upon the hard work of the people who are involved in all these arenas. But I think this sort of overall cooperation has encouraged these people to talk and to develop outcomes that they may not have otherwise been capable of reaching. So one of the things that we've been able to accomplish is in-stream flow protection on BLM streams like this. This is a stream in western Colorado called Tabawatch Creek that has sensitive fish in it. It has sensitive riparian communities. And between cooperation between BLM and DNR, we've been able to protect more than 150 stream reaches that cross BLM lands in Colorado. And that's a wide range of different stream types, all the way from little streams that are 1 cubic foot per second, all the way up to streams that are hundreds of cubic feet per second. And we've done this all over the state in all different kinds of environments, in headwaters streams, in lower elevation streams that are, downstream from significant amounts of water use. It's been for cold water fisheries, for warm water fisheries, for aquatic insects, for riparian species. So for a whole broad array of natural environments. We've done something that I really, really credit the state of Colorado for really stepping up to the plate on. This has been a huge advance for the state of Colorado, is when we started cooperating with the in-stream flow program, there weren't too many in-stream flows in low elevations on the state's major rivers. And now we have accomplished some of that in-stream flow protection. And an example is on the San Miguel River in western Colorado. downstream from Telluride, from a big resort area, from irrigation, from communities. And on this river, we have 3 sensitive fishes, flannelmouth sucker, bluehead sucker, and round-tailed chub, where we have an appropriation based on maintaining those fish, and we would all like to use this appropriation to help prevent a listing of these species under the Endangered Species Act. We've also accomplished, sorry about that. We've also accomplished in-stream flow protection for wilderness area. We had a federal designation of the Dominguez Canyon Wilderness Area just south of Grand Junction, Colorado. And because of discussions of stakeholders, that incorporated a really unique water rights approach. You may be aware that water protection has held up a lot of wilderness designation in Colorado. And we were able to get this designation done because there was an agreement that the designation would say that the federal government does have a federally owned water right for this landscape, but, and this is a very important but if the Colorado Water Conservation Board and its in-stream flow program steps up and makes an appropriation that's sufficient in volume and magnitude and timing to maintain wilderness values, then the federal government will not adjudicate or claim its federal water right. And the Colorado Water Conservation Board did just that. Based on a recommendation from BLM, the Colorado Water Conservation Board appropriated all the unappropriated flow on the streams in this wilderness area, minus a very small development allowance for a few small private inholdings up in the headwaters of these watersheds. And so, in my mind, that was sort of a really significant achievement because, water protection for these lower elevation wilderness landscapes has it's been elusive. I'm just going to hold this thing. And then some of the other things that have happened is we've got more certainty for water users. We have some stakeholder groups where we are proactively addressing the potential impacts from water supply projects even before the projects are built or before they're happening. We're already thinking about that. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. The water users in Colorado, through this kind of cooperation, have become much more engaged and better educated about wild and scenic rivers, and they are very, very engaged now in BLM's wild and scenic rivers processes. And I think we're getting better decisions out of it because they're not surprised about what the decisions that are coming out in our land use plans and the trade-offs that we're making in those decisions. An example of that is we have a group called the Upper Colorado River Wild and Scenic Stakeholder Group. And this is in the part of the river upstream from Glenwood Springs, Colorado, to about Kremling, Colorado. And the group's comprised of water users, landowners, recreationists, local governments, environmental groups. And this group is actually funded by the Colorado Water Conservation Board and by money put in by the stakeholders. And they created an alternative river management plan for the portion of the Colorado River between Kremling and Glenwood Springs. And they are implementing studies to document the outstandingly remarkable values on the river corridor. They're implementing monitoring, and they're implementing cooperative flow management measures so that those values can be maintained in the river. And so they packaged this up and submitted it to BLM and the Forest Service for consideration in our land use plan, and we have decided to rely upon this plan to help us maintain the flow in the Colorado River to support those values. So lots of benefits for the federal agencies because we don't have flow management authority, but yet we're charged with managing these values like recreation, scenery, fishery that are completely flow dependent. And so what's happening is extra resources and extra capability is being brought to the table. Let me see here. I'm getting short on time, so I'm going to breeze through this very quickly. An example of some of the resources that are being brought to the table, the stakeholders in the Upper Colorado River Basin have committed to creating a $1 million fund to fund projects on the Upper Colorado River that would benefit the ORVs. They're bringing in monitoring resources that BLM and Forest Service don't have. So we're just getting other stakeholders that have resources to come to the table and help us manage these resources. We're getting early heads up on issues, like I mentioned, because of some of these interactions. we're hearing that some water users are concerned about what could happen to water facilities under BLM's sage-grouse land use plan amendments. And you don't think of sage-grouse as potentially affecting water facilities, but that concern's out there. And we're hearing about it and we're reacting to it early rather than waiting down the timeline and having people, being super concerned and thinking about litigating our plans. So hopefully in the end, we're getting better buy-in on BLM decisions. So I just want to end up with saying, this approach, this sort of cooperative approach may not work in every landscape. I want to be the first to say that, where BLM has reserved water rights, we're very committed to, quantifying and protecting and using those water rights. But where we don't have federal reserved water rights, and that includes a super large percentage of BLM lands, these cooperative approaches are working, really well for us, because even if we could do whatever we want on federal land, when federal land's intermixed with private land, those private land operations and water rights could completely dry up a stream, and there's nothing we could do about it. So we really do have to have an approach and a flow protection mechanism that works on all jurisdictions, all land ownerships. It works in situations where claiming a federal water right might impede stakeholder support for protecting important landscapes. The stakeholders in Dominguez Escalante were very, very concerned about federal water rights, and I'm not at all certain that that legislation would have ever happened if we couldn't have figured out this alternative approach. It sort of broke that impasse and helped us implement a stakeholder-driven approach. So my concluding note is, this is the philosophy that I have followed in implementing this MOU, and it's a philosophy that was given to me by a very wise BLM manager early in my career, and she told me, don't focus on who's going to have control, don't focus on difference of philosophy, because there's always going to be differences in philosophy. Don't focus on who's going to get the credit or the blame. Focus on what the solution needs to look like on the ground. What do people want this landscape to look like? And if most people think that a solution that they're considering will look right on the ground and they can live with that solution, then it's the right solution. And so that's what I've tried to do in implementing this MOU, and it seems to be working, trying to let that stakeholder-driven approach works. So the last comment that I want to make is, if you are working in landscapes like this and you're advising staff on how to accomplish these solutions, one of the things I want to point out is I've had very frequent discussions with my legal counsel about how can we do these sorts of cooperative things without running afoul of federal laws and federal authority. I've had to have discussions like, how can we do this and not violate the Federal Advisory Committee Act? How can we do this without abrogating or giving away our responsibility under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act? How can we do this without violating BLM's planning regulations? That's the kind of support that legal counsel can give the professionals and the agencies that are trying to do this kind of work. And that's it, and I'm open for questions.